At 23 years old, Karolina Hunter wrote a letter that would destroy a gentleman's career and nearly cost her everything. She didn't mean to. She wrote it in a freezing London lodging where her baby's cries echoed off bare walls, where the last candle burned too low, and where 3 shillings stood between survival and the street. Exhaustion blurred her hand. One number slipped. One address went wrong. Instead of reaching her brother, the letter arrived at the London residence of Reuben Morrison, Duke of Ravensmoor, a man whose name opened Parliament doors, whose estates stretched across 3 counties, and whose grief had turned him into a stranger in his own houses. He should have ignored it. He should have passed it to a servant and forgotten it ever existed. Instead, he read it twice. Then he answered. What began as a quiet act of mercy became something far more dangerous. The Duke offered Karolina work organizing his late wife's accounts, simple charity, he told himself, for a desperate mother. But Karolina carried a secret she never spoke aloud. Her schoolmaster father had trained her to see numbers not as sums, but as stories. And buried deep within the Duke's ledgers, she would notice a pattern no one was meant to see, a discovery that would turn kindness into conflict and a single mistake into a reckoning neither of them could escape. The candles were burning too fast. Karolina Hunter watched the tallow drip and knew she'd miscalculated. 3 candles per night, that was her rule against the dark, but tonight, the drafts were stronger than she'd expected. Her daughter slept at last in the drawer lined with Karolina's shawl, the only softness left in a room that tilted slightly, as if even the floor had grown tired of holding her up. She dipped her pen. Her hands shook, though whether from cold or hunger she could no longer tell. Her brother hadn't answered her last 2 letters. Perhaps they'd gone astray. Perhaps he'd moved. Perhaps he simply had nothing to give. She wrote anyway. Thomas, I need 3 shillings for milk. The baby cries through the night. Please, if you can spare it. She addressed the envelope from memory, her mind dulled by exhaustion. The motion was familiar, automatic. She did not notice when her pen faltered, when 2 digits traded places, and a modest street became something far grander. The letter left with the morning post. She burned the final candle low and told herself tomorrow would bring an answer. Across London, Reuben Morrison, Duke of Ravensmoor, sat alone at a breakfast table laid for 12. The correspondence arrived on a silver tray, parliamentary notices, invitations sealed in crests, a report from his steward. And then one letter that did not belong among them, thin paper, ink smudged to the corner, faintly scented with tallow smoke. He read it once. Then again. The butler waited. Shall I have it returned, Your Grace? The address appears to be an error. The Duke said nothing. The plea was bare of pretense, stripped to its bones. 3 shillings, milk, a crying child. It felt less like a letter than an intrusion into something private. He reached for his personal stationery. 3 days later, a footman in Ravensmoor livery stood in the narrow hallway of Karolina's lodging house. Her landlady called up the stairs with poorly concealed excitement. Karolina descended slowly, her daughter on her hip, wearing the least mended dress she owned. The sealed envelope in the footman's hand told her instantly that something had gone wrong. She read the reply where she stood. The bank draft slipped from her fingers. £5. Enough to change everything, and enough to bind her to something she did not understand. Pride rose first, then her daughter cried, thin and exhausted. Pride yielded. She wrote back with care. Your Grace, I accept this kindness as a loan, not charity. Repayment will follow when circumstances allow. She signed only her initial. At Ravensmoor House, the Duke read her reply and paused. No embellishment, no pleading, just terms. He wrote again. If repayment is required, I have work. My late wife's accounts need order. Room and wages provided. You may bring your daughter. He sent it before anyone could object and before he asked himself why a misdirected letter had begun to feel like the first honest thing to enter his house in years. The townhouse rose before her like a cliff face of white stone and gleaming windows, each one larger than the room she'd left behind. Karolina stood on the pavement with her daughter bound against her chest beneath her patched cloak, her borrowed case containing everything she owned: 2 dresses, 3 shifts, her father's copy of Euclid, and a wooden rattle her husband had carved before the fever took him. She counted the windows, 12 across, 4 stories. This single building could swallow 10 of her lodging house whole and still have room for gardens she couldn't see from the street. She climbed the steps before doubt could root her in place. The housekeeper who answered her knock wore black bombazine and an expression of profound skepticism. "Mrs. Thornby," she introduced herself, looking Karolina up and down with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to detecting imposters. This thin, exhausted woman with a baby in a sling and sleeves that had been let down twice, this was His Grace's new appointment? His Grace's instructions were quite specific, Mrs. Thornby said, her tone suggesting the instructions had been highly irregular. "Private rooms on the 3rd floor, meals sent up, no questions about the child." Each phrase landed like a concession extracted under duress. Karolina followed her up a staircase wider than her former room, past walls hung with portraits of people who'd never known cold, into a corridor where even the silence felt expensive. The room Mrs. Thornby showed her had actual glass in the windows, whole panes, not the cracked and mended sort. A fireplace with coal already laid ready for lighting, a bed with a frame that didn't sag, a mattress that looked thick enough to hold a body without complaint, a small adjoining chamber with a cradle, empty and waiting, as though someone had known she was coming. Karolina set down her case. Her daughter stirred against her chest, but didn't wake. She didn't cry. Crying would be surrender, and she'd survived too much to surrender to kindness. "His Grace will see you in the study at 4 o'clock, Mrs. Thornby said. "Someone will come to fetch you." When the housekeeper left, Karolina stood alone in a room with a door that locked from the inside and windows that kept the wind out, and permitted herself one long, shaking breath. The Duke received her in a study lined with books that actually appeared red, their spines creased and covers worn. He was exactly as she'd imagined from his handwriting, controlled, formal, handsome in the distant way of classical statuary, the kind of beauty that didn't invite touch. Dark hair touched with premature silver at the temples, eyes that assessed without judgment. He gestured to 4 trunks against the wall, each bound with leather straps gone dusty with disuse. "My late wife's correspondence," he said. His voice was carefully neutral. "Personal letters, household accounts, charitable records. 4 years of—" He paused. "The task has been postponed." Karolina understood. 4 years since his wife's death, 4 years of grief sealed in trunks because opening them would mean facing what he'd lost. "I'll need to know your preferences for organization," she said. "By date, by correspondent, by subject matter? Organize as you see fit." He met her eyes directly. "I trust your judgment." The words landed like a blow to the chest. It was the first time anyone had said those words to her in 2 years, not since her husband's family had made it clear that a schoolmaster's daughter with no dowry and no connections possessed no judgment worth trusting, not since poverty had reduced her to someone whose only value was in staying quiet and grateful. "I won't disappoint you," she said, and heard her voice come out steadier than she felt. "I don't believe you will." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Mrs. Thornby has instructions to provide whatever you require. If you need anything, you have only to ask." After he left, Karolina stood alone among the trunks holding 4 years of a dead woman's life and felt something unfamiliar stir beneath her exhaustion. It took her a moment to recognize it as hope.
If you're listening right now, Help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Karolina approached the work the way her father had taught her to approach Euclid, with systematic precision and the understanding that chaos yielded only to patient methodology. The first trunk held social correspondence, invitations to garden parties, thank you notes for christening gifts, letters from a sister in Bath discussing nothing of consequence. She sorted them by date and correspondent, created a simple index, moved on. The second trunk was different. Household accounts, estate expenditure records, tenant correspondence regarding repairs, disputes, hardships, charitable distribution lists noting which families received coal, which needed medical expenses covered, which children showed promise for educational sponsorship. The Duchess had managed far more than tea appointments and seating arrangements. She'd run an empire of small mercies with the precision of a general organizing supply lines. Karolina felt an unexpected kinship with this woman she'd never met, who'd written Tenant McBride's Roof, urgent, before winter rains, in the same firm hand she'd used to accept a dinner invitation. She worked through meals the first week, barely noticing when trays appeared and disappeared. Her daughter napped in the cradle, while Karolina cross-referenced ledgers, built chronologies, discovered the architecture of a household that had once functioned with elegant efficiency. On the 8th afternoon, comparing receipts for stonework repairs, she frowned. 2 invoices, both with Whitmore & Sons, masonry. The first, dated April 1820, listed garden wall repairs at the Kent estate, £47. The second, dated March 1823, listed nearly identical work at the Surrey property, £66. 40% higher, for the same contractor, the same type of work. No notation explaining the increase, no addendum about changed material costs or expanded scope. She set both receipts aside and kept digging. By evening, she'd found 3 more instances, each time prices climbing without obvious justification, each invoice approved with the same cramped signature, E. Blackwood, steward. She found Mrs. Thornby in the kitchen, directing preparations for dinner. "Forgive the interruption," Karolina said. "I've encountered some discrepancies in the household accounts. Nothing urgent, but I wondered, who is Mr. Blackwood?" "The estate steward," Mrs. Thornby said, not looking up from the menu she was reviewing. "He's been with His Grace's family for ages, managed everything during the late Duke's time and after." Her tone suggested the conversation was finished. "These receipts show considerable variation in pricing for similar work. Is that typical?" Mrs. Thornby looked up then, her expression patient in the way of someone explaining basic facts to a child. "Mr. Blackwood handles all financial matters. If he approved it, it must be proper." Karolina nodded pleasantly and returned to the study. But her father had taught her that must be proper was how errors became tradition, how small corruptions calcified into accepted practice, how those who profited from confusion defended it as complexity. She pulled her own notebook from her case, the one she'd used years ago to work through mathematical proofs, its pages now mostly empty. On the first clean page, she began a second ledger, a private accounting. Date, contractor, service, price, comparison, discrepancy. She worked by candlelight after her daughter slept, building a catalog of questions that had no obvious answers. Perhaps there were explanations. Perhaps material costs had risen. Perhaps the Surrey property required specialized work. Perhaps. But Karolina had learned the hard way that perhaps was often just another word for don't look too closely. She wrote each discrepancy in her careful schoolmaster's hand, noted each pattern, and said nothing to anyone. Not yet.
The Duke noticed things in the way someone emerging from a long illness notices light. Gradually, then all at once. Karolina appeared at breakfast on the 5th morning with her daughter bound against her chest. The staff had insisted, Mrs. Thornby explained with faint disapproval. Infants belonged in kitchens where it was warm, not cold studies where mothers worked themselves into consumption. His Grace didn't object, so the matter was settled. She sat at the far end of the table, her daughter drowsing against her, and worked through correspondence while barely touching the food placed before her. She ate like someone who'd learned to survive on scraps, taking just enough to quiet the stomach's complaint. The Duke watched this pattern repeat for 3 days before quietly instructing Mrs. Thornby to send a proper tray of the study at set intervals. Karolina didn't thank him effusively when it appeared, simply nodded once and returned to whatever document held her attention. It was, he realized, refreshing. Most people in his orbit thanked him for breathing. One evening, returning from a parliamentary session that had stretched past dinner, he found lamplight spilling from the study doorway. Inside, Karolina sat surrounded by ledgers, estate maps spread across the desk, her daughter asleep in a basket lined with what looked like the study's velvet curtain tiebacks. She was cross-referencing columns of figures against property boundaries, making notations in 2 separate notebooks. "You're going beyond the assigned task," he observed from the doorway. She didn't startle. "I found inconsistencies," she said, not looking up. "I thought you'd want to know." Something in her tone, the absence of apology or presumption, made him step fully into the room. "Show me." She turned one of the ledgers toward him, pointed to 3 entries with the tip of her pen. "These estates, different counties, different sizes, different land quality according to the maps, but the annual rents reported are identical down to the shilling." He leaned closer. She was right. He'd never noticed. "And here," she pulled another ledger forward. "Stone wall repairs. This entry from your Kent property shows £47. This one, 3 years later, similar work at Surrey, £66. This one, same contractor, same approximate length of wall at your Berkshire holding, £93. The Duke's jaw tightened. He'd seen these ledgers 100 times, signed the authorizations, approved the expenditures, never questioned the figures because the accounts always balanced, the estates remained profitable, and questioning implied distrust. "Perhaps costs increased," he said, hearing the weakness in his own argument. "Perhaps," she didn't sound convinced. "But when I checked timber prices for the same years, those remained relatively stable, and the contractor appears to charge wildly different rates with no correlation to material costs or property location." Who prepared these accounts? "Mr. Blackwood, according to the notations." She finally looked up at him. "I assume he's trustworthy?" The Duke knew Edward Blackwood, had known him for 15 years. Genial, well-connected, a second son of a baronet who'd served Ravensmoor interests faithfully through his father's declining years and into his own tenure. Edward had managed the transitions seamlessly, had never asked for anything beyond his salary, had friends in half the great houses of England. Hadn't he served faithfully? Or had the Duke simply never looked closely enough to see otherwise? "What else have you found?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. "Enough to warrant further investigation, not enough to make accusations." "Then don't make accusations." He met his eyes. "Document everything, every discrepancy, every question, every pattern. I want a complete accounting." "Your Grace, if there's nothing wrong, the documentation will show it. If there is," he paused, "then I need to know exactly how wrong things are." She nodded once, turned back to her ledgers. The Duke stood there a moment longer, watching her work with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned that carelessness had consequences, and realized he'd given a desperate stranger access to his private papers on nothing but instinct. For the first time in 4 years, his instinct felt sound. Edward Blackwood arrived on a Tuesday morning in a coat that cost more than Karolina had earned in a year of needlework. 50 years old, prosperous in the way of men who'd never questioned where prosperity came from, he moved through Ravensmoor House with the ease of long familiarity. Karolina encountered him in the first-floor hallway, carrying a stack of the Duchess's charitable correspondence back to the study. He barely glanced at her before speaking. "You there. Fetch Mr. Morrison's correspondence from the study. I need last quarter's planting reports." She stopped, adjusted her daughter's weight against her hip. "I'm organizing the Duchess's papers," she replied evenly. "You'll need to ask Mrs. Thornby about general correspondence." Blackwood's smile appeared instantly, reflexive as breathing, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those remained calculating, reassessing. "And you are—" "Miss Hunter. His Grace employed me to catalog—" "Ah, yes, the charity case. Not cruel, not even particularly unkind, simply dismissive, the way one might note a stray cat the cook had started feeding. Well, stay to your letters, girl. Estate business is rather beyond." "Miss Hunter has proven quite capable." The Duke's voice came from behind them, cold as silk drawn across a blade's edge. He stood in the doorway of his private office, still holding the document he'd been reading, his expression perfectly controlled and absolutely frigid. "Her observations on the estate accounts have been particularly valuable." Blackwood's smile never wavered. A lesser man's would have. "Has she? How industrious." He turned to the Duke with the easy familiarity of old friendship. "I'm glad you found useful work for the young woman, though I do hope she hasn't been troubling you with questions about routine expenditures. The accounts can seem quite complex to those unfamiliar with estate management." "On the contrary," the Duke said, "her questions have been remarkably astute. We should discuss them during your visit." "Of course, Your Grace. Always happy to clarify any confusion." Blackwood inclined his head to Karolina with perfect courtesy. "Miss Hunter, do continue your excellent work with the letters." He moved past her toward the Duke's office, trailing the scent of expensive tobacco and confidence. Karolina continued to the study, set down the correspondence, and realized her hands were shaking. Not from his condescension. She'd survived worse than being called a charity case, had been called far worse by her late husband's family when they'd turned her out with nothing but the clothes she wore. Not from his dismissal of her capabilities. She'd spent 2 years being dismissed. No, her hands shook because of the look he'd given her in the half-second after the Duke mentioned the accounts, before the smile had reformed, before the easy manner had reasserted itself. She'd seen that look before, on the face of her landlady when Karolina had mentioned the missing rent payments that 3 other tenants had complained about, on the face of a foreman at the textile workshop when she'd pointed out that the piecework rates didn't match the posted schedule. It was the look of someone who'd been operating in comfortable darkness, suddenly aware of light approaching. That wasn't dismissal, that was warning. Karolina sat at the desk, picked up her pen, and opened her private ledger. Her hands steadied as she wrote. She'd been warned before, my men more overtly threatening than Edward Blackwood with his gentleman's smile and well-cut coat. She'd survived those warnings, too. She noted the date of his visit, the substance of their exchange, and returned to documenting discrepancies with methodical precision. If he thought she'd be frightened into silence, he'd badly misjudged how much a woman with nothing left to lose could afford to care about warnings. Karolina found the trustee documents at 11:30, buried in the third trunk beneath layers of household inventories and charitable receipts that had clearly been designed to discourage deep investigation. Her daughter slept in the basket. The house had gone quiet hours ago. She worked by lamplight, cross-referencing signatures, tracing authorities, building the architecture of how power had been transferred during the Duke's deepest grief. The agreements were legal, properly witnessed by a solicitor whose name appeared in respectable directories, signed 4 months after the Duchess's death, when the Duke had been barely functional, when estate management must have seemed like an unbearable complexity better delegated to capable hands. Edward Blackwood's hands. Most of the language was standard authorization to negotiate with tenants, approve routine maintenance, manage seasonal staff, but buried in the second addendum, in prose so dense it read like deliberate obscurity, was a clause permitting Blackwood to approve expenditures up to £500 without dual signature. £500, a fortune for repairs, paid to contractors Karolina had spent the last week trying to verify. She pulled out her private ledger, traced one name she'd seen repeatedly, Whitmore and Sons, Masonry. No listing in London directories, no business address in Bath, Bristol, or any regional registry she could access through the Duke's library. No advertisements in trade publications, nothing but a name in payments totaling £3,000 over 3 years for work that may or may not have ever been performed. She stood, her decision already made, and walked through the silent house to the Duke's private study. Light showed beneath the door. She knocked once. "Enter." He sat behind his desk, still fully dressed at midnight, staring at nothing with the particular emptiness of someone whose thoughts had gone somewhere memories lived. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression made him straighten. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I believe you're being robbed." She laid out the evidence methodically, not dramatically, not with accusations or emotional appeals, just facts arranged in their terrible logic. The trustee documents granting excessive authority, the false contractors with no verifiable existence, the inflated costs with no correlation to actual market rates, the diverted rents collected from tenants to cover improvements that had never benefited them. All of it shielded by Blackwood's granted authority in the Duke's grief-induced inattention. The Duke listened without interrupting, his face growing progressively more still. "How much?" he asked finally, his voice carefully empty. "Conservatively, £15,000 over 4 years, possibly twice that depending on how many contractors are fabricated. A fortune, not enough to bankrupt a duke, but enough to cause real harm, enough to force tenants into higher rents, enough to defer legitimate repairs, enough to matter. By someone I trusted. Not a question, a statement of fact he was testing against reality. By someone who knew you were too grief-stricken to notice," Karolina said. "The agreements were signed 4 months after your wife's death. The theft began 6 months after that." The Duke's hands curled into fists on the desktop, then deliberately, with visible effort, relaxed. "We'll need irrefutable proof, testimony, documentation he cannot explain away. His reputation will shield him unless the evidence is overwhelming. I'll find it. Miss Hunter." He met her eyes. "If he realizes what you're doing, he'll come after you. Your reputation, your position, you have far more to lose than he does. I know what I'm risking." "Why?" The question emerged rawer than he'd intended. "You've done enough. You've uncovered it. I could proceed from here, keep your name out of it entirely." Karolina thought of every man who'd dismissed her, every door closed because she was poor, female, inconvenient. Every time being right had mattered less than being powerless. "Because someone should care that it's wrong," she said. "Not just expensive, not just embarrassing, wrong. He stole from you, yes, but he also stole from tenants who trusted that their higher rents were actually improving their holdings. Someone should care about that." The Duke studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then we proceed carefully, and Miss Hunter, thank you." She returned to the study, to her sleeping daughter and her ledgers of evidence, and continued building the case that would bring down a gentleman.
Blackwood didn't attack openly. That wasn't how gentlemen fought. Violence was for the lower classes. Reputation was the weapon of choice among those who understood how society actually worked. The rumors began subtly, carried on the kind of concerned whispers that spread faster than scandal because they wore the mask of worry. The Duke had grown peculiar in his grief, hadn't he? Understandable, of course, after such a loss, but this business with the woman, hiring some common creature, desperate by all accounts, giving her access to his late wife's private papers. She'd been seen emerging from his study at odd hours, working alone with him, the two of them, past midnight. And the baby she claimed was her own, was it? Or was this arrangement rather more irregular than his Grace's household cared to admit? No one said anything directly, that would be crude, but eyebrows raised, voices dropped to meaningful murmurs.
Concern expressed itself in sideways glances and strategic silences. The Dowager Duchess of Ravensmoor arrived on a Thursday morning in high dudgeon, her traveling coach barely settled before she swept into her nephew's study without waiting to be announced. "Reuben, what is this I hear about a woman in the house, an unmarried woman with a child?" The Duke looked up from the correspondence he'd been reviewing. "Miss Hunter is cataloging Charlotte's correspondence. The task needed doing." At midnight, the Dowager's voice could have etched glass. "Reuben, appearances matter. I know you've been in mourning, but you cannot simply ignore. I don't care about appearances." "Well, you should." She paced before his desk, agitation making her movements sharp. "Edward Blackwood came to see me. He's concerned about you. Said this woman has been making wild accusations about the accounts, disturbing you with conspiracy theories." The Duke's expression went arctic. "Did he? He's worried she's manipulating you, exploiting your grief to secure her position. Reuben, you took her in out of charity and now she's— Miss Hunter has found evidence of theft." His voice could have frozen Thames in summer. "Substantial, systematic theft from these estates. Would you like to see the documentation?" The Dowager went pale. "That's absurd. Edward would never— He's my godson. I've known him since he was a boy. There must be some mistake." "There is," the Duke said, "and it's been bleeding this estate for years, while I was too grief-stricken to notice, and you were too trusting to question. I won't hear accusations against Edward based on some desperate woman. Get out." The Dowager stared at him. "I beg your pardon. You heard me. I have evidence to review and no patience for willful blindness. If you wish to defend Blackwood, do so after you've examined the accounts. Until then, get out of my study." She left in offended silence, her skirts snapping with indignation. But the damage was done. The Dowager would repeat this conversation to a dozen friends by evening. Edward's version of events, the manipulative woman, the grief-addled Duke, the wild accusations, spread through drawing rooms like fire through dry timber. The Duke began noticing the changes within his own household. Servants who'd been cordial to Karolina now whispered when she passed. Mrs. Thornby's requests for her preferences became perfunctory. The footman who'd previously smiled at her daughter now avoided eye contact. An invitation to a trustee's preliminary meeting, routine business but traditionally open to anyone involved in estate documentation, arrived addressed only to him. Miss Hunter's assistance would not be required. He crumpled the invitation and threw it in the fire. Blackwood was isolating her, making her testimony questionable before she could deliver it, transforming her from credible witness to suspect woman, the kind whose word gentlemen didn't need to take seriously. It was, the Duke had to admit, expertly done, the kind of warfare that left no visible wounds, but destroyed just as effectively as any blade. He found Karolina in the study that evening, working by lamplight while her daughter slept. She looked up when he entered, and he knew that she knew. The isolation, the whispers, the invisible walls closing around her. "He's very good at this," she said quietly. "Yes," the Duke agreed, "he is. Does that change anything?" He met her eyes. "Not one damned thing." The break-in happened on a Wednesday evening while Karolina was at dinner, the first meal she'd taken in the dining room since the whispers began, and only because the Duke had explicitly requested her presence to discuss a question about the Duchess's charitable distributions. She returned to find her door ajar. Nothing taken. Her few dresses still hung in the wardrobe. Her father's Euclid remained on the bedside table. Her daughter's things untouched in the small adjoining chamber. But her private notes, the ledger of discrepancies she'd kept hidden beneath the mattress, lay scattered across the desk, pages deliberately disordered. The current page left open to her most recent entries, documenting Blackwood's false contractors. The message was clear. "We know what you have." She stood in the doorway, her daughter heavy in her arms, and felt ice settle in her chest. Not fear, something colder. The recognition that she'd crossed some invisible threshold and the path behind her had disappeared. The Duke arrived within minutes, summoned by Mrs. Thornby, who'd seen Karolina's face. He took in the scene with a single glance, his jaw tightening. "Pack what you need," he said. "You're moving to the family wing, tonight." By midnight, she occupied a suite that had probably housed visiting duchesses, with a footman posted outside her door ostensibly for her convenience, but actually for her protection. She was effectively confined. Safe, yes, but cut off from the household movements that might yield the final proof she needed, the conversations between servants, the comings and goings of visitors, the small details that built into patterns. Blackwood visited the following afternoon. She heard his voice from her new rooms as he greeted the Duke with easy familiarity, the tone of old friendship, concerned but not accusatory. She crept to the top of the stairs, staying out of sight, and listened. "Reuben, I'm worried about you." Blackwood's voice carried the perfect note of gentle concern. "This situation with Miss Hunter, I fear her circumstances may have made her unstable, seeing conspiracy where there's only the natural complexity of estate management." Karolina watched the Duke's hands curl into fists at his sides, then deliberately relax. His voice, when he spoke, remained controlled. "You're suggesting I'm incompetent to judge my own affairs?" "Of course not, only that perhaps your grief made you vulnerable to someone who desperately needed rescuing. It's understandable. You wanted to help her, and now she's constructed this elaborate fantasy to justify her position, to make herself indispensable. Then let's arrange an independent review." The Duke's tone could have cut stone. "I'll present Miss Hunter's findings to the Board of Trustees next week. You'll have the opportunity to explain every discrepancy she's documented, publicly, before witnesses." Silence. Then, "I see." Blackwood's voice had changed, lost some essential warmth. "You're quite serious." "Completely." "Very well." The mask reformed. Karolina could hear it happening even without seeing his face. "Of course, Your Grace. I welcome the chance to clear up this misunderstanding. I'm sure once the board reviews the accounts, they'll see that everything has been handled properly. I'm sure they will see exactly what's been handled." More silence. Then the sound of Blackwood's footsteps crossing the hall, the front door opening and closing. Karolina remained at the top of the stairs, watching the Duke stand alone in the entry hall, his shoulders rigid with tension he could finally allow himself to show. He looked up, unsurprised to find her there. "He'll come at you," she said quietly. "Not me. You. He'll make you look incompetent, grief-mad, manipulated." "I know." "Are you certain you want to proceed?" The Duke's expression held something she hadn't seen before, not anger, though that was present, something fiercer, something that looked like the decision to stop being haunted by grief and start being dangerous. "Miss Hunter," he said, "I have just declared war on a man who's stolen from me for 4 years while I was too broken to notice. The only question now is whether we have enough evidence to win it." She thought of her scattered notes, the false contractors, the diverted funds, the tenants who'd paid higher rents for improvements that never came. "We'll find it," she said. "Then let's get to work." The trustee meeting convened at 10 o'clock on a gray Tuesday morning in Ravensmoor House's formal library, where generations of ducal business had been conducted beneath oil portraits of men who'd never questioned their stewards. 6 trustees arranged themselves around the mahogany table. The Duke's solicitor, gray-haired and methodical, took his place at the end. 2 independent auditors, hired secretly 3 days prior, sat with leather portfolios closed before them, and in the corner, observing with the particular stillness of state authority, a parliamentary representative whose presence transformed this from family business into a matter that could reach the crown. because Ravensmoor estates included crown leases. Fraud here wasn't merely theft, it was breach of trust with the realm itself. Karolina was not invited. Women didn't attend such meetings. She remained in her suite in the family wing, her daughter on her lap, and waited for the verdict that would determine whether the last month of her life had meant anything at all. But her evidence attended. The Duke stood at the head of the table and began to speak. No notes, no hesitation. Ledger by ledger, transaction by transaction, he laid out the anatomy of theft. False contractors who existed only on paper, inflated costs that bore no relationship to market rates, rents diverted from tenant improvements into accounts that couldn't be traced. He'd memorized every detail, every discrepancy, every question Karolina had documented in her private ledger. His voice remained steady, his presentation methodical. This wasn't anger, this was prosecution. Blackwood listened with the expression of a patient man enduring an unfortunate misunderstanding. When the Duke finished, he responded with smooth assurance. "Your Grace, I believe we're looking at simple misunderstandings, clerical errors perhaps, but nothing that suggests deliberate wrongdoing. As for these contractors Miss Hunter couldn't verify, they were subcontractors, all perfectly legitimate, simply not listed under the primary names she searched for." "Then produce their records," the Duke said quietly. "I'd need time to retrieve documentation from—" "You've had a week's notice of this meeting." Blackwood's smile tightened fractionally. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular, conducting an inquisition based on a woman's amateur interpretation of complex estate management." The auditors found the same discrepancies. Silence fell like a blade. The senior auditor opened his portfolio. "We were engaged to conduct an independent review of Ravensmoor estate accounts for the period 1821 to 1825. Our findings corroborate Miss Hunter's documentation in every particular." He slid a bound report across the table. "Additionally, we traced certain investments made by Mr. Blackwood during this period, properties purchased in a nephew's name, shares in companies that subsequently received lucrative estate contracts. The timing is suggestive." One of the trustees leaned forward. "Edward, surely you can explain." "This is persecution," Blackwood said, his composure finally cracking. "His Grace approved these arrangements during his grief. He simply doesn't remember giving me broader authority to—" "I remember everything," the Duke said, then reached into his coat and withdrew a letter, its paper yellowed slightly with age. "This was written by my late wife 2 months before her death, to her solicitor." He read aloud, his voice breaking for the first time. "I fear Edward is taking advantage of my husband's affection during this terrible time. Please review the attached accounts. The numbers don't reconcile. Something is wrong, and Reuben is too grief-stricken to see it." He set the letter on the table with careful precision. "She died before the review could occur, before she could make me listen, and I was too lost in grief to hear what she was trying to tell me." Blackwood stood abruptly. "This is absurd. I won't remain here to be accused by a dead woman's paranoid scribblings and a desperate widow's fantasies." "You'll stay." The parliamentary observer's voice cut through the room like winter wind. "You'll remain seated until these accounts are explained to the Crown's satisfaction. Sit down, Mr. Blackwood." The investigation consumed 3 hours, line by line through the ledgers, question after question that Blackwood couldn't answer satisfactorily, contractors he couldn't produce, invoices that didn't match any verifiable work, money that had simply disappeared into complexity. At 1 o'clock, the trustees voted. Blackwood's authority revoked, his bond forfeit, his name formally struck from Ravensmoor Estate Service and reported to the Crown's Estate Office. No criminal charges. His rank, his connections, his gentleman's status, they protected him from prison. But socially, he was destroyed. No estate would employ him. No club would admit him. No drawing room would receive him. His name would become synonymous with betrayal of trust, whispered as warning wherever stewards were hired. He left in silence, his face gray as ash, decades of carefully constructed respectability crumbling in a single afternoon. The Duke watched him go and felt nothing but exhaustion. A week after the trustees' meeting, The Duke found Karolina in the garden, where spring was beginning its careful negotiations with winter. Her daughter moved across the grass in those unsteady steps peculiar to new walkers, more controlled falling than actual locomotion, reaching for flowers she couldn't yet name. "The trustees asked me to convey their gratitude," he said, standing at a respectful distance. "Apparently the Crown is reviewing similar arrangements across other estates. Your documentation has become something of a template. You may have uncovered a widespread practice." "I'm glad." She didn't sound glad, sounded exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleepless nights with a teething child. "Miss Hunter, Karolina, I owe you more than gratitude. You owe me nothing." She kept her eyes on her daughter. "You gave me work when I needed it. The rest was simply doing what needed to be done." "I'm offering more." He moved to stand beside her, both of them watching the child explore the world at ankle height. "Estate manager for my smaller properties, actual authority, not just bookkeeping, a house of your own, education funds for your daughter, a position with real power to implement the reforms you've already suggested." She looked at him for a long moment. "Because I proved useful, or because you pity me?" "Because you're better at this than anyone I've employed in 15 years, and because you give a damn about doing it right. The useful part is secondary." "I'm a woman." "I noticed." "The tenants won't accept. Then they'll adjust or find new holdings." His voice carried an edge she'd rarely heard. "I'm done caring what people accept. I nearly lost everything because I cared more about appearances than truth, because I let grief make me blind to what my own wife tried to tell me. I won't make that mistake again." Karolina smiled, small, genuine, the expression transforming her face in a way that made the Duke realize he'd been waiting to see it. "I accept, on one condition." "Name it." "We call it salary, not rescue. We call it employment, not charity. I won't build a life on gratitude." "Agreed." He offered his hand. She shook it, firm, equal, the grip of someone who'd negotiated on her own terms and won. "There's one more thing," the Duke said, suddenly awkward in a way that made him feel 15 instead of 34. "The letter, the original letter. You said you'd repay the loan. I haven't forgotten. I'm choosing to consider it paid through services rendered. You saved this estate considerably more than £5. Your Grace, Reuben, and I'm not being generous. You saved far more than you borrowed, probably saved the estate itself from bleeding to death. It's simple mathematics." She laughed, the first time he'd heard it, the sound like something that had been locked away and finally permitted freedom. Simple mathematics. "Very well, Reuben." They stood in comfortable silence, watching her daughter discover that grass stains and mud were endlessly fascinating. Neither mentioned what else might be growing between them, what other foundations might be laid on this ground of mutual respect and hard-won trust. Time enough for that. Time enough to discover whether what had begun in desperation and necessity might transform into something chosen freely by both of them. For now, this was enough. A woman who'd proved she was more than poverty's victim. A man who'd remembered that power mattered only when used justly. In the knowledge that the strongest foundations of estates, of families, of futures were built on truth, not tradition. The misdelivered letter would sit framed in Karolina's new study, a reminder that sometimes the best destinations are the ones we never meant to reach. 2 years later, Karolina Hunter managed 4 Ravensmoor properties with an efficiency that had become legendary among estate managers across England. Her quarterly reports were studied, copied, implemented. Her reforms, fair rents, transparent accounting, tenant councils that actually held power, were gradually transforming how enlightened landowners thought about their obligations. Her daughter attended a school in Bath where girls learned mathematics alongside needlework, Latin alongside deportment, and were told that intelligence was not unfeminine. The Duke still wrote her letters, properly addressed now, no mistakes.
sometimes about business, a question about crop rotation, a request for her opinion on a new steward candidate, sometimes about nothing in particular, a book he thought she'd enjoy, a political debate in Parliament she'd find infuriating, his opinion on whether roses or lavender suited a particular garden better. She wrote back, always, in her careful schoolmaster's hand that had once trembled with hunger and now moved with confident precision across fine paper she no longer had to ration. And once, when spring softened London's edges and made even Mayfair briefly beautiful, they walked in the garden while her daughter played nearby, and he asked a question that had nothing to do with ledgers or tenants or propriety. She answered yes, not because he'd rescued her, but because they'd built something together that neither could have built alone, because respect had deepened into something that looked like the beginning of love, and love freely chosen was worth more than any rescue. Survival had never been the measure of her worth, but choosing to live fully, to trust again, to build a future rather than simply endure the present, that was everything.